You edit out the irrelevant parts.
The editors.
Do we have a minion?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is a very special occasion. I don't think I've ever participated. Maybe I have, but I certainly have not led a Siyam Mishnayos for Shas. So we're going to make up the protocol as we go along. You're supposed to start every speech with a joke. Well, actually, this is not a joke, but it's a good story. So my life for the past months revolves around making sure I go to Minyan 3 times a day on time. I typically go to Minyan, but the on time part is quite challenging, so you have to plan ahead. So yesterday I davened in Savannah, Georgia. Gorgeous shul, really nice, very warm community. And this morning we woke up in Alexandria, Virginia, which is 20 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. And so I davened at Kesher Israel, the shul that Joe Lieberman is perhaps the most famous member. Because it's D.C. and because I like to run, I brought my running clothes with me. And it turns out that you have 2 hours free parking, which was perfect for the amount of time I wanted to go running. And I went running. I went running towards the mall. I went to the Lincoln Memorial. And I get to the reflection pool. There's a tour guide coming leading 200 high school students from Mississippi. And he, on his microphone, he says to everybody, "Oh, and here's a local enjoying today's beautiful Washington weather." And I say, "I'm not a local." "Oh, where are you from?" "I'm from Israel." "Oh, well, you know, the Jewish tradition shares a lot with the American tradition. So you're not such a foreigner." I said, "You're absolutely correct." I told him, "You know that the reason that when Washington established Washington, D.C. as the capital, it was not in the jurisdiction of any of the 13 original colonies. It was a separate entity." And he didn't make that up. He got that from David HaMelech, I tell him. King David, when he established Jerusalem as the capital, he picked a site that was not in the jurisdiction of Binyamin, or Benjamin, like I told him, in Judah, but it was exterritorial. He said, "I've been giving this tour for 30 years, I didn't know that." And I said, "Well, the founders of the country, of our nation, your nation, they did know their Bible." And he said, "You're right." And all these Mississippi kids were starting to rank on him. And then I said, "And you see that building?" I pointed to the White House. "Next to it is the Capitol. And over there is the Supreme Court. From here, the U.S. Constitution derived the notion of checks and balances. That's also not an American concept. They took that from us. According to Jewish law, the king cannot be the high priest. He cannot be a member of the Sanhedrin, of the High Court. And thereby, you have separation of powers." And he said, "That's fascinating. Wow, you really contributed a lot to world civilization," the guy tells me. I said, "Yes." And under my breath, I said, "And had you not murdered a lot of us, then, you know, we would have contributed a lot more." But I didn't mention that. Anyway, the reason I mentioned this story is that my wife can't stand my stories. She has no patience for them. But my mother did. She loved hearing my stories. And I would tell her. And now I have this story, and I frankly don't have many people to share it with. So that's why this evening is a celebration in honor of my mother. And Siyum Mishnayos. We had a very special evening 2 Motzei Shabbos ago in Miami. As you all know, my mother abruptly left her community. Virtually everyone didn't know her illness, and they didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye. So we had an evening, and it was very, very special. We had over 50 people come, pillars of the community. Martin and Geraldine Brody came. This is a physician who's got to be in his late 80s, if not 90s. He has not left his house to go to shul or at all because of COVID. But for this event, he and his wife came to honor my mother, and it was very special. The Rebbitzin of Young Israel, Mrs. Lairfield, who's an Eichenstein, she came. She's not well either. Her caretaker brought her, and she made a point to come. And many people that I didn't know were close to my mother came, and it was very special. And I didn't film it, so I'll say very quickly what I said that night. I wanted to say that this is not a shiva. It's not a shiva for many reasons. First and foremost, we're saying divrei Torah. You don't say divrei, you may not say divrei Torah at a shiva. And it was actually very appropriate because 2 Motzei Shabbos ago was after we had read Chayei Sarah, when we discussed the passing of a great matriarch. And the parsha opens up, Vayiyu Chayei Sarah Mea Shana Shivim Shana Sheva Shivim Shnei Chayei Sarah V'tamu Sarah B'kirat Arba Hi Chevron Be'eretz Canaan Vayavo Avraham Lispod L'Sarah V'Livkosah. Avraham came to eulogize and to mourn, to cry for his wife. And Balei Kriya, and anyone who sees the text, how it's supposed to be written, see that the kaf on the word to cry is a small kaf. Rav Soloveitchik, in his Out of the Whirlwind, notes that in Judaism there are 2 types of mourning. There's what's called Avelut Yeshana, or national mourning, versus Avelut Chadasha, personal mourning. Avelut Yeshana is when a person is menachem someone at a shiva house, you say Hamakom Yinachim Oscha B'toch Shar Avelei Tzion V'Yerushalayim. What does that mean? We're all mourners. Who are the Avelei Tzion V'Yerushalayim? All of us. We are all mourning Yerushalayim. And so therefore I'm able to console you because we are in effect all mourners. And that's Avelut Yeshana. Avelut Chadasha is when, lo aleinu, one of the 7 relatives passes away, and then everything changes, and the halachos are very radical, very radical. When I found out that I now have the status of an onein, which is the immediate status after the loved one passes away, I found it very difficult to not by rote say a bracha. The second time, it got a little easier. The third time I got afraid because I was getting kind of used to skipping davening, not saying brachos, but after 48 hours, that was over. But aninut is a very, 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 it's challenging, but it's also a bracha. In Out of the Whirlwind, Rav Soloveitchik explains that it would be cruel for halacha to expect a person to be mekayim mitzvos. You can't violate anything. All the lotases you must keep, but the aseis you may not keep. You may not keep because HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that you're not very happy with him at this time in your life. And that you're probably angry and you have lots of questions. And therefore he says, it's a chesed not to do it. But then there's Shiva. And Shiva, you can't leave the house. Shiva, and so the community comes. You're not allowed to eat your own meal when you come from the funeral, from the burial. Your community has to support you. We had a very intense Shiva. It was I had never said Shiva before, and frankly, it was intense to the extent that the second night of Shiva, I was very tired. I was falling asleep, frankly, at my chair, and I said I have to go to sleep. It was 9:30, so I excused myself and I went to bed. 9:35, Sarah knocks on the door or whatever, and she says, "The mayor of Beit Shemesh is here to be Menachem Ava." I said it would be really bad if I come down. I'm not in a good place. So, so Sarah, she talked to her, which was nice, but it can be very challenging. But Rav Soloveitchik notes that as time goes on, the laws of Avelis get relaxed with respect to personal Avelis, right? It starts with a very extreme aninut. It goes to the first 3 days of Shiva where the Menachemim are not allowed to open their mouths. They have to wait for the Avel to speak. Then the last 4 days, and once Shiva's over, so you can leave your house, but you can't get a haircut, you can't shave, and gradually the laws get relaxed. And the reason is because it's part of life, and halacha doesn't want you to dwell in your sorrow. It's interesting that the Rambam, I believe it's Perek Yud Gimel Halacha Dalet in Hilchot Avel, he notes that it is prohibited to mourn excessively. He says that it's wrong because halacha doesn't want you to mourn excessively. On this particular case, I cannot say na'ed doresh na'e mekayem because we have letters of the Rambam that were found in the Cairo Geniza. The Rambam was supported by his brother, who was a wealthy businessman. His brother tragically died in a shipping on a boat that capsized. And the Rambam writes himself, I didn't get out of bed practically for 7 years because I had mourned so greatly. So, can't judge. Rav Soloveitchik said, I am part of the Brisker tradition. We don't go to graves. We are not big on Kvarim. It's not something that we do. He never went to Kvarim until his wife passed away. His wife passed away. He went every Erev Shabbos to the kever. So, but the point that I'm trying to make is that it's a little cuff, says Rav Soloveitchik, in order to show that we don't excessively mourn. On the flip side, when it comes to national mourning, so frankly, many of us don't feel the loss of the Beis Hamikdash on a day-to-day basis. So therefore comes Shivas Tammuz, and now certain laws kick in. You can't make a Shechianu. You can't, that's about it. Right? What else can you do during the 3 weeks? Comes Rosh Chodesh Av, then you can't have meat, you can't do laundry, it gets serious. And then comes Tisha B'Av, it's very serious, it's like Shiva. But Soloveitchik said each of these periods can be categorized halachically. Shivas Tammuz until the end of Tammuz, that's Yud Bet Chodesh, 12 months of mourning. From Rosh Chodesh Av, that's like Shloshim. Tisha B'Av is like, well, you have the first half of Tisha B'Av, the second half, which is parallel to the first half, the first 3 days of Shiva, the last half days of Shiva, where you can sit down. But the idea is that it's the opposite because we have to bring ourselves to feel the loss. When it comes to a family member, you don't need to artificially feel the loss. You feel the loss, but halacha wants you to gradually go back into society and continue. And I think certainly Mama, that's what she would have wanted. So I had told the community this was a celebration of my mother's life, and that's how I think the mood in the room was, and that's exactly how she would have wanted it. I had red plates, red cups, red napkins, because it's a talent. My wife was able to capture Sarah. She gave a 1.5 minute hesped practically, where she said, you can summarize my mother's life with one word, colorful. She had a colorful house, colorful salads, colorful nail polish, which meant a colorful refrigerator. Her language was colorful. She was very colorful. Everything was incredible, amazing, or no, I don't like that. You know, she was never bland about anything, and that's who she was. So if we're going to talk about the Siyam, so now I'm going to say something which frankly is, as may have been apparent already, I'm what people would call a Kalta Litvak. I don't get excited of Rebbe stories and miracles and so forth, but I think I was witness to my own personal miracle because my mother left a box. So my father and I, we had the schus to go through everything and make sure that nothing valuable was lost. So in this box, she kept all of the Mesifta newsletters. I don't know, I didn't read them. I don't know if all of them, but probably the ones that mentioned Louis and Leon in there. She mentioned, there was a newsletter from my yeshiva when my best friend and I, my wife's current boss, we led a Seder at the army base across the street from the yeshiva on Pesach. A lot of nice memories. And then there was this. This is a Dvar Torah that I wrote for this week's Parsha. There was no other Divrei Torah in the box. This is the only Dvar Torah. The Dvar Torah was written Vayetze 5757, which is 1996. I didn't know why she read it, why she kept it, until I got to the last page. And frankly, I can't think of a more appropriate Dvar Torah to say for the week of Vayetze that we're reading the Shabbos. And I'm very proud of this actually, because I never saw anyone else come up with this idea. If I have a chiddush, this is my chiddush. And I read it this afternoon, and I liked what I read, so I think I'm just going to read it again out loud. The Parsha of Vayetze discusses inter alia the courtship of Yaakov and Rachel. In the marriage agreement drafted between Lavan and Yaakov, Yaakov was to work for a period of 7 years as a precondition for receiving Rachel's hand in marriage. And indeed, Yaakov fulfilled this clause diligently, and is regarding one verse in particular of the scripture's narrative describing Yaakov's toil during these 7 years that I wish to focus upon, and specifically the latter portion of Pasuk Lamed Vav, Perek Lamed Vav, Pasuk Kaf. And Yaakov thus worked 7 years for Rachel, yet in his eyes they were but a few days, due to his love for her. Vayu beinav ki yamim achadim ba'ahavato ota. Everyone asks the question. I asked the question here, so I'll just read it. But I'll say it outside. That is counterintuitive. When you really want something, it's an eternity. You wouldn't say, oh, I can't wait to marry her. It's 7 years. Oh, it's like 70 years. But the Torah says the opposite. His love for her was 7 years, which in his eyes was like but a few days. So frankly, I don't remember if I wrote this, but I think the best explanation is that she was worth it. She was worth it. If he had to work 70 years, he would have worked it. So therefore, the 7 years, that was just like only a few days. The verse gives rise to a question asked throughout the generations by countless of commentators, namely, how could these 7 said years transpire as if only a small number of days? For intuitively, one would think just the opposite. The more one yearns for a future event, the greater is the anticipation for its occurrence. When one starts to focus upon the realization of a particular event in his or her subjective perception, time will elapse at a far slower pace, being that he or she is so hung up in their constant thoughts and actions. This psychological premise is in fact supported by a verse in Proverbs, brought by the Siftei Chachamim and Rashi. Prolonged expectations will yield to faintness of the heart. I frankly don't remember the pasuk. Anyone remember? Prolonged expectation. It's a Perek Yud Gimel pasuk Yud Beis. This verse is based upon the assumption that great expectations can seem as if a lasting eternity, and not the opposite, as the verse concerning Yaakov apparently claims. The 7 years should not have been but a few days. Rather, they should have felt like 70 years. As already cited, many answers have been provided in order to resolve this query, and I wish to offer my humble, yet daring suggestion. The aforementioned verse ends with a statement that the 7 years seemed as if only a few days, due to his love for her. Bi-ahavato ota. It doesn't say bi-ahavato et Rachel. The object of this phrase, her, ota, is left undefined. The most plausible interpretation is prima facie that her refers to Rachel. Rachel is the ultimate objective of his labor. However, in my opinion, especially in light of the difficulties with this reading as cited above, one can argue the case that the days which slipped by but a few days were not referring to Rachel, rather to Yaakov's love for his mother, Rivka. The basis of this radical suggestion comes from none other than Rashi. For just 2 verses prior to the verse under discussion, he cites a few days, Yamim Achadim, with those who remember in Shul last week, we also had the phrase Yamim Achadim. Yamim Achadim doesn't appear anywhere else in Tanakh, to the best of my knowledge. With the few days uttered by Rivka at the end of last week's portion of Tolda. Rivka says that overhearing Esav conspires to murder his brother, Yaakov, she tells him, I probably wrote it out, so let me just read this. Rashi does not expound upon this correlation, and he merely highlights the analogy. It says, here are Yamim Achadim, in Toldos, and in Vayetze it says Yamim Achadim. The context of Rivka's statement was a consequence of Yaakov's deception and Esav's subsequent scheme to assassinate Yaakov. Rivka orders Yaakov to flee their home in Beersheba and to seek refuge with her brother in Padan Aram. However, lest Yaakov become overly depressed with the notion of leaving his homeland and the house of his family, Rivka comforts Yaakov with the assuaging revelation that his duration with Uncle Lavan will not prolong a great amount of time. Rather, he will merely be there, Yamim Achadim, a few days. Hence, this innovative interpretation, the few days that Yaakov was meant to stay in Lavan's house, in truth, became 20 years. Yet due to the special bond and love which existed between Yaakov and Rivka, the 7 years of toil and great suffering on behalf of Rachel, which, as we know, due to Lavan's trickery, Yaakov had to settle for Leah, and was required to work an additional 7 years for Rachel. So they were but a few days, because that was what Rivka said would be. Must be borne in mind that Yaakov's childhood in the house of Yitzchak was amidst difficult circumstances, an antagonizing brother, and seemingly a lack of love from his father, right? It says, and Yitzchak loved Esau because he craved hunted food, and only Rivka loved Yaakov. Vayahav Yitzchak et Esau kitzai befiv, veRivka ohevet et Yaakov. It doesn't say for any ulterior motive, any reason. She loved him because a mother loves her son. The only shred of hope and warmth that Yaakov received stemmed from Rivka. Rivka granted Yaakov a sense of security, self-confidence, and faith, which enabled him to achieve the understanding that despite the strenuous challenges, there, ultimately, is a purpose and light will emerge from the end of the tunnel. I don't know why I wrote this. I say no political entendres intended. In 1996, Bibi Netanyahu opened the Kotel tunnels, which nearly sparked a second or third intifada. The second intifada was actually in the year 2000. But I wrote this it was the summer of 1996. This feeling of certainty that Yaakov obtained in the house of Rivka provided the necessary foundation required for grappling with the ensuing confrontations and doubts which faced him in the house of Lavan. Hence, when Yaakov is presented with the bitter information that in order to merit Rachel, he must undergo another period of 7 years of arduous labor. The hope and faith which he received from Rivka empower him with the resources required to successfully combat his every challenge. I find another scenario in the Bible which reflects this very idea of a special relationship between parent and child, and the unique bond which existed between Hannah and Shmuel. I heard this idea from my mother-in-law. Yes, I did. Hannah and Shmuel are found in similar circumstances as Rivka and Yaakov, in that both sets are faced with a situation of parting from one another for a long period of time, if not indefinitely. Hannah, however, prays that this connection with her son should not sever when she undertakes to offer Shmuel to serve in the tabernacle in Shiloh under the tutelage of Eli the Kohen Gadol for all the days of his life, and that this separation not be perceived as abandonment or banishment, despite this great physical distance that will be between the two. To this end, Hannah knits Shmuel a coat, as a token of their inseparable bond and love which will accompany him his entire life. And as we shall immediately see, even beyond that, at the end of Shmuel Aleph, following the death of Shmuel, Shaul HaMelech wishes to seek Shmuel's counsel, and he thus approaches the witch of Endor. What is it? It's not Machshefa. Something shall Endor. How does the Tanakh refer to her? The witch of Endor, in order to conjure up a spirit. The witch of Endor, successfully calls up the spirit of Shmuel. And in order to ensure that this is indeed Shmuel, Shaul demands that she describe his appearance. Her description is as follows. Shmuel Aleph, Perek Kaf Chet, Pasuk Yudalet. An old man emerges, and he is wearing a coat. And Shaul thus knew this was Shmuel. He still wore the coat. He must have outgrown the coat. But Shmuel is still wearing the coat that his mother knitted for him as a permanent connection that he'll always have with his mother. The coat eventually becomes known as Shmuel's calling card, meaning it has symbolized the mighty tie which existed between Shmuel and Hannah. Perhaps this is what enabled Shmuel to attain the heights that he had reached, the greatest person of his generation, due to the love and confidence that Hannah bestowed onto Shmuel. Despite the great distance between Hannah and her son, Shmuel never forgot for a moment how dear he was to Hannah and how much she has sacrificed for his behalf. Finally, I would like to conclude with a portion from a book authored by Rabbi Norman Lamb, Faith and Doubt. Somebody said that Rabbi Lamb should have written an autobiography. It would have been, had he done so, it would have been entitled The Halachic Norm. Anyway, in Faith and Doubt, in my opinion, is of supreme importance in the area of contemporary Jewish thought. The book contains many significant points. However, I feel that perhaps the most important section of the book is the dedication. One sentence. Dedicated to Pearl and Samuel Lamb. The title of the book is Faith and Doubt. Dedicated to Pearl and Samuel Lamb, whose faith in me I never had doubt. Which is very nice. This is again an expression of the very same idea which we find with Rivka and Yaakov, continuing through Chana and Shmuel, and that is, in order to deal with life's challenges and doubts, a person must find a source of love and support which will bestow him with the strength necessary to survive and to overcome the unknown perils which face him. Shabbat Shalom. And now I understand why my mother kept it for all these years. Dedicated in loving memory of my grandparents. It was, Chayei Sarah was my mother's yahrzeit, and in particular my grandfather, Chaim ben Avraham, whose yahrzeit is this month. So I must have sent it to her because I dedicated in memory of our grandfather, Awelo. And I just think that I'm going through these papers, and the Dvar Torah is about a mother's love for her son. And people say things at Shivas. Some things are inappropriate, some things are funny, but somebody said something very poignant that has not left me. Somebody said that there's perhaps only one person in this world, when they ask you, how are you, they really mean it. And that's your mother. And certainly, Mama loved all of her children, and it's a big loss. There is a story, well, I'll tell my story, and I'll tell the other story. My story is that when I was 14 or 15, I told my mother, Mama, I have a lisp. I can't say the S properly. It's going to affect me. I want to be a lawyer. Actually, I didn't want to be a lawyer then, but whatever. It's going to affect me giving Divrei Torah. I won't be able to be a public speaker. I'm not a public speaker. And she said, you don't have a lisp. You're perfect. Now, something could be said about showering someone with too much love, because I do have a lisp, and it probably would have been good had I gone to a speech therapist, but I didn't. And at the same time, my mother said, you don't have a lisp. I love when you speak in public. And that, I guess, any inhibition that I may have had, she took away, which is a great blessing. The story that probably perhaps everyone knows and probably are thinking of is the story about Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison lived in a generation which did not know about ADHD. But we would say that he was hyperactive and he had ADHD, and he was uncontrollable in the classroom, and the principal kicked him out of school. The principal, the teacher, whatever it was. He comes home with a letter. The letter is told to be handed to his mother. He can't open it. He dutifully hands her the letter. She reads the letter, which says, you're going to have to homeschool him. You can't, he's destroying any ability for me to teach. And the principal agrees. He's kicked out of school. She says, your teacher says there's nothing for you to get out of school anymore because you're such a good student that she wants me to teach you the things that she can't teach you, and she gave him a big hug. And the rest is history, as they say. After his mother passed away, so Thomas Edison is going through the memorabilia, and the letter is there. And he read the real letter. So, I think we are ready to be Messiah.